The best trick for prolonging your health is shortening the period of time that you eat food during the day. Second best trick, try not to eat.
Hey Insider, we have a special interview for you today featuring a world-renowned cardiologist, heart surgeon, medical researcher and author, Dr. Stephen Gundry. During his 40-year career in medicine, he performed countless heart transplants, developed patented life-saving medical technology, and published over 300 articles and book chapters on his research. He's on a mission right now to improve health, happiness, and longevity through a unique vision of human nutrition. So if you're wanting to discover the foods that are secretly killing your energy, as well as your vitality, as well as the popular lies that nutritionists want you to believe, and what you should do instead in order for you to truly thrive, then be sure to listen very attentively to the wealth of wisdom that's scattered throughout today's interview. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this special interview episode featuring Dr. Stephen Gundry. What have you personally noticed from your vast experience as the most common recurring bad habit that often holds back high achievers from having supreme health?
Well, I think a lot of times high achievers want to measure their success in terms of business achievements and how many companies you form and how many you've sold. And while all that's important, many of us, particularly younger, will sacrifice our personal health, our personal sleep, our personal eating habits to achieve these goals. And what I can assure almost everybody is when these high achievers who haven't been taking care of their health reach their 50s, their 60s, maybe their 70s, everything comes home to roost. I just wish I could have met some of my patients earlier in their life when they didn't develop a cancer that they were shocked with, when they developed pre-diabetes, diabetes, high blood pressure, and they kind of felt that, well, this is just a part of getting old. And then sadly, so many of my high achievers, when they reach their 70s and 80s, notice their memory is not the super sharp functioning edge that got them where they were. And they so many of them say, what happened? I wish you had told me, when I was 30, what to do about my health, because I've got everything else in the world. But, as I tell people, this is the only house that we're ever going to live in, at least as far as we know. And if we spent as much time taking care of this house as we do for our homes, our businesses, imagine what high achievers could achieve if they focused on this.
Yeah, for sure. So if we were to focus on this right now, what would you say is the best first step for us to really focus on in terms of being able to improve our health?
Okay, I think two things, and they're almost diametrically opposed. The first thing that I've spent the last 22 years researching is the microbiome, this collection of hundreds of trillions of microorganisms that live in our gut, that live in our mouth, that live on our skin. They actually even live in a cloud around us. The microbiome has really only been known about now for 15 years when the Human Microbiome Project was completed. And we now know that there's a symbiotic relationship between these organisms that live in us and on us and our health. And in fact, we are more importantly the home of the microbiome than really anything else. And in one of my bestsellers, The Longevity Paradox, I point out that longevity in health span, how many years we live well, really correlates exactly to the health of our microbiome, the diversity of our microbiome, and the interaction between the microbiome and the lining of our gut wall. And we could delve into that if you want. And if you look at, for instance, 105-year-old people in thriving health, and these people exist, I have a couple in my practice, they have the diversity of the microbiome of a 30-year-old person. Whereas if you look at most people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, they have a very almost desert-like microbiome. Very few species, very few interaction among species, and it's this diversity, kind of a tropical rainforest that you want, that in fact fosters good health. And we're finding more and more that the microbiome's happiness in their home and what you give them to eat to make them happy is actually going to end up making you happy, and they're going to support the home that they live in, which happens to be us. So this symbiotic relationship has, in the West, been destroyed by things I go into, like our food, like Roundup, glyphosate, which in America is now sprayed on almost everything. It's in our wines in America. It's in all of our grain products. It's in all of our beans. Antibiotic use. We use not only personally huge amounts of antibiotics, which destroy our microbiome, but we feed the vast majority of the antibiotics to our animals. And we eat the antibiotics that's in the flesh of our beef, our pork, our chickens. And little did we know that those residual antibiotics in the meat that we eat actually also kills off our microbiome. So it's no wonder that we basically have a desert for our microbiome.
Right.
So that's number one. The second thing, which is actually really easy to do, and I talk about this extensively in Unlocking the Keto Code, is many people have heard that calorie restriction is one of the only ways to extend lifespan. And there's huge amounts of data, beginning in fruit flies all the way to rhesus monkeys, that cutting an animal's calories by about 30% is remarkably effective at extending health span and lifespan. This was questioned with the rhesus monkey studies of the University of Wisconsin and the National Institutes of Aging. And there were two simultaneous rhesus monkey studies that spanned over 30 years. And they found in these studies with calorie restriction that both sets of monkeys in these two institutions had great improved health span. But only one of these two studies was their increased lifespan from calorie restriction. And everybody, including myself in this field, wondered why that was. The diets were slightly different. And then Dr. Rafael DeCabo from the NIH, where I was a fellow, said, I think we've got calorie restriction all wrong. I think that when you calorie restrict an animal and give them their food, we usually put it out one time a day. And if you have 30% less to eat, you're pretty doggone hungry when that food comes out. And you're going to eat that food rapidly, and it's going to be gone. And then the rest of the day, you're going to be fasting. And he said, I think it has to do with the shortened time that these animals are eating their food, and the extended time that they're not eating is actually the effect we're looking for. And he designed an elegant series of experiments, and to cut to the chase, he in fact found that it wasn't so much the reduced calories that the animals were eating, but it was the reduced amount of time that they were eating. And so this has been duplicated now in humans, and it's been found that if we can reduce people's eating window, the time you start eating at the beginning of the day and the time you end eating in night, to about 6 to 8 hours. And what that looks like is, okay, let's have breakfast break fast at noon, and let's finish dinner at 6 o'clock, just as an example. That's a 6-hour eating window or a 18-hour fasting window. And if you do that, you produce dramatic changes in health span, in activation of genes that prevent cancer. And for a high achiever, being at your peak health, just by limiting the time you eat, is actually really easy to do once you learn how to do it. And if nothing else, for a high achiever, eating is, in a way, a pain in the neck because it takes you away from things that you could be doing. So, for instance, for the last 22 years, from January through June during the week, I only eat my calories in a 2-hour window from 6 to 8 o'clock at night. So 22 out of 24 hours, I'm fasting. And I've been doing that now for 22 years. That frees up. I don't have to eat breakfast, don't have to eat lunch. I can actually work through the lunch hour. And in my 70s, so far so good. So I know that anybody can do this.
Wow. So on the first point you was mentioning about some of your clients who've made it past 100, they had incredible microbiomes. I suppose I'm curious to know what sort of health habits causes an individual to damage their microbiomes or really reduce it, if that's the right term I'm using right now.
Yeah, I think one of the things I point out in almost all of my books, number one, super old people in general eat whole foods, and they actually eat their whole foods whole. Our great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents would eat, let's just use an example, a sweet potato, and they would cook a sweet potato and they would eat it whole. They wouldn't make sweet potato fries. They wouldn't make sweet potato chips. They wouldn't make sweet potato flour and make pasta out of it. They left these things intact. And one of the things, sadly, that has happened to us out of convenience is we've taken sometimes perfectly healthy foods and we've pulverized them into a fine powder. Let me take, for example, wheat, which is not high on my list of good foods, but let's pulverize wheat into a fine powder and turn it into flour. It turns out that flour has a much higher glycemic index than table sugar. It actually makes our blood sugar higher and faster than table sugar because we have no business grinding these things into ultra fine powders that we can absorb. So that's one thing. We've 70 to 8% of most of the food most people eat is highly processed. And as I talk about in many of my books, when we eat highly absorbable foods, our mitochondria, which produce energy, normally can handle sugar molecules, amino acids from proteins, and fatty acids from fats, and generate ATP. But they usually do this, sugars come first, followed later by proteins, followed still later by fats. And so they have a system of processing. What's happened to all of us is that all three of these substances arrive at the mitochondria simultaneously for processing. And I live in the LA area, and it's literally like rush hour most of the day. And we've got all these food substances arriving for processing, and in fact, nothing moves. And it's no wonder that now 80% of Americans are overweight or obese because our processing systems aren't working and we just store everything as fat.
Makes a lot of sense. So processed foods, definitely, stay clear of those.
Yeah, and the problem is many driven, successful people say, "Oh, what the heck? I've got to get to this meeting. I've got to, I'm going to go grab a granola bar. I'm going to grab a protein bar. I'm going to grab a shake." Many people say, "Well, I'm going to have a fruit smoothie," without realizing that number one, our fruit has been bred for sugar content. And when we grind up fruit into a smoothie, it's like mainlining fructose, which is actually one of the best mitochondrial toxins that anybody's ever created. And one of my sayings from my first book was, "Give fruit the boot." Now, that's not to say you can't have fruit, but our ancestors actually only had access to fruit seasonally. And when I was growing up, a blueberry was this little bitty, bitter blue fruit that you had to pour a cup of sugar on to make them edible. But now blueberries even have been bred for sugar content, and we can eat handfuls of these things and go, "Oh, they're so sweet." The other problem was blueberries only existed for a month or so in season. And now we have blueberries 365 days a year. We fly them in from Chile and Argentina or Mexico. And we really have no system to handle this much sugar 365 days a year. It's literally endless summer for most of us. And we weren't designed that way. Just as an interesting aside, great apes, and we happen to be a great ape, only gain weight during fruit season. And fruit, even in the jungle, fruit ripens once a year. And great apes are very well designed to take the sugar in fruit and convert it to fat. We actually have inherited that genetic trait. And so it's no wonder that in our kind of fruit-centric society, we perpetually have summer and are gaining weight.
This is so fascinating. I suppose I want to know what foods must we avoid then? Is there like a food that is preached as really good that you really do not recommend?
Yeah, my first mega bestseller was The Plant Paradox, The Hidden Dangers of Healthy Foods. And whole grains are right up there on some of the worst foods that we can eat. And people go, "Wait a minute, whole grains are so healthy for you." Well, human beings never ate a grain until 10,000 years ago. They did not exist as a food substance for humans. And after agriculture started about 10,000 years ago, most humans before 10,000 years ago were about 6 feet tall. And after agriculture, humans actually shrunk about a foot in 2,000 years. And arthritis was unknown in human skeletons until after grains were discovered. And then we began to see arthritis extensively. Even the Egyptians had extensive arthritis in their bones. So there are a class of plant defense systems called lectins. And lectins are proteins that are designed by a plant to stick to sugar molecules that line the lining of our gut. They line our joints. They line actually the surfaces where nerves communicate. They actually line the inside of our blood vessels. And these molecules, if they can get to the wall of our gut, can create leaky gut. Now, that's not pseudoscience. It turns out that intestinal permeability, better known as leaky gut, was proven to occur from lectins like gluten, which is in wheat, rye, and barley, by Dr. Alessio Fasano, who's now at Harvard. And he showed that, in fact, these particles can attach to the wall of our gut and break what are called tight junctions that hold these spots together. And then we literally have a passage through the wall of our gut. And what's fascinating is 80% of all of our immune system, all of our white blood cells are right behind the wall of our gut. And they're there because that's where mischief can come across. And Hippocrates, the father of medicine, 2,500 years ago, said all disease begins in the gut. Now, he didn't have the sophisticated tests we have to measure leaky gut, but this guy knew 2,500 years ago that it was all happening, down here. And I've paraphrased him that all disease begins in a leaky gut. But the good news is, and what I do in my career is you can repair a leaky gut, so that all disease begins in a leaky gut, but all disease begins and ends by repairing a leaky gut. And it's been exciting. I see a lot of individuals, high performance individuals who have, for instance, autoimmune diseases, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis or Crohn's or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, who we put on our program and heal their leaky gut, and their autoimmune diseases subside. About, in my published data, 94% of people with an autoimmune disease will come off of their medication, will lose the markers for autoimmune disease in 6 to 9 months after we start this program.
Wow. Is there a specific diet that you would recommend that we would all know?
Well, so the one many people have heard of, I've sold millions of books, and the diet has been translated into 36 foreign languages. It's called the plant paradox. And simplistically, what I tell people not to eat is far more important than what I tell people to eat, which is kind of surprising. But in general, what I try to do is get people to remove high lectin containing foods from their diet. Those are the grains and even pseudo grains. So for instance, quinoa is loaded with lectins. Buckwheat is loaded with lectins. The bean family. Beans have some of the highest lectin content there are. Now, the good news about beans is that you can soak and pressure cook beans and make them perfectly safe. And there's several companies now that have canned beans that have been pressure cooked, so they're perfectly safe. Another one that surprises people is the Nightshade family. And these are actually originally American plants that were brought back by Columbus 500 years ago to Europe and to Asia. And all of us are from Europe, Africa, or Asia originally. And it wasn't until 500 years ago when Europeans, Africans, and Asians were exposed to American plants. And these include corn, they include potatoes, they include peppers of all kinds, tomatoes, eggplant, and believe it or not, goji berries. Goji berries are an American plant that are loaded with lectins. So you look at cultures that use these foods, particularly, for instance, the Italians. The Italians always peel and de-seed their tomatoes before they make tomato sauce because the peel and the seeds have the lectins. The Italians always peel and de-seed their peppers. The Southwest American Indians always peel and de-seed their peppers before they either eat them or grind them into chili powder. Many hot sauces are fermented, and fermentation breaks down lectins. Interestingly, the Incas actually soaked quinoa for several days and then fermented it, allowed it to rot before they cooked it. So I study how cultures have detoxified foods, and it's fascinating how many cultures to use a particular food have detoxified the lectins.
Right. Am I right in saying the diet you talk about in that book is quite similar to the Mediterranean diet?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. The Mediterranean diet has been looked at for its beneficial effects and its negative effects. And it turns out that one of the huge benefits of a Mediterranean diet is that many of the foods, for instance, olive oil, for instance, red wine, a lot of the vegetables are loaded with a class of compounds called polyphenols. And these polyphenols I discuss extensively in the new book, Unlocking the Keto Code, that polyphenols work by protecting our mitochondria. So the Mediterranean diet is loaded with polyphenols. And interestingly enough, the negative aspects of a Mediterranean diet, which are the grains and the beans, are counteracted by the positive effects of the Mediterranean diet, which are the polyphenols. Another fascinating finding recently of blue zone diets, and blue zones were described by the journalist Dan Buttner, who described 5 places in the world with extended long-term health. And interestingly enough, I was a professor for most of my career at the only blue zone in the United States, which was Loma Linda, California. But these blue zones, 2 of them have a very unique feature. One is the mountainous region of Sardinia, the island off of the coast of Italy. And another region is the Nagoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. And these areas have been described very well by Dan, and they have, quite frankly, a high grain consumption and a high bean consumption in both of these areas. But the definitive factor that separates these people from their neighbors is actually the amount of goat and sheep cheeses that these 2 cultures eat. And there's some fascinating effects on mitochondria of goat and sheep cheeses, actually improving the health of mitochondria. And you can actually look at the Sardinians who were up in the mountains herding goats and sheep and look at their health versus the Sardinians that live down by the sea, who are not goat and sheep herders, but they're actually fish eaters. And only the Sardinians that live in the mountains eating goat and sheep cheese have extended lifespan and health. The same people living on the same island eating a different food don't.
Wow.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So you was mentioning also, though, the Mediterranean diet, it almost counteracts the negative side because they're eating specific foods.
Correct.
Does that mean if you eat these specific foods, you are still allowed to eat the foods you don't normally recommend?
Yeah, to a point. One of the problems with most people is that gluten, which is present in wheat, rye, and barley, and also in oats, is a major disruptor of the intestinal wall. And we can measure this. And the vast majority of people with leaky gut have an incredible sensitivity to gluten. Now, I've published one study where once we seal a leaky gut, we can see that the people's immune status to gluten, how vaccinated they are against gluten molecules, actually goes away. The immune system forgets that gluten is a problem. Let me give you a personal example, which I've written about. Years ago, when we first started measuring autoimmune markers in all of our patients, we measured them in us personally. And my assistant came running into my room and she said, "Doc, you've got lupus." And I go, I don't have lupus, an autoimmune disease. And she says, "Yeah, you have a marker for lupus, anti-nuclear antibody." And I go, "Well, that's interesting because I have a very strong family history on my father's side of psoriasis, which is an autoimmune disease." And I said, "Yeah, okay, that's interesting." And I'm always experimenting with food. So I said, I think I'm going to try to turn this marker off. So I ate perfect. I avoided all the foods I tell people to avoid for 2 weeks. And I redrew my anti-nuclear antibody marker, and it was negative. I went, all right, great. My immune system is no longer activated. So when I was writing The Longevity Paradox and editing it in New York City a few years ago, I had a a weekend between sessions. And I said, I really should see if I can activate my lupus marker. So I cheated. I had pizza, I had tomatoes, I had bread, I had pasta. And I came back to Palm Springs and I rechecked my lupus marker. And sure enough, it was positive. And I went, wow, that's great. I wonder how fast I can turn it off. So I waited 1 week eating perfectly and rechecked it, and it was off. Now, what does that tell me? It tells me that I can produce leaky gut and I can activate my immune system. And the good news is I can repair my leaky gut very, very quickly. So does that mean I can cheat and get away with it? Well, maybe, but the point is the wall of my gut's in pretty good shape and my intestinal bacteria are in pretty good shape. But I can tell you that most of my folks, when they cheat, they know it. They all of a sudden, for instance, a joint may flare up or they feel achy or their stomach hurts. And I could go on and on. But the good news, we can prove that the immune system can be retrained to calm down. And I think that's actually exciting information.
So that means we can basically heal ourselves.
Correct. Absolutely.
Right. That's awesome.
Let me give you one more example, which to me is fascinating. Most human beings are born with a preformed antibody to the peanut lectin. Peanuts are actually a bean. And most of us are born with an antibody to the peanut lectin. And most people know what antibodies are now. We want antibodies to COVID, when we get a shot, and we can measure anti-COVID antibodies. So these are actually how we attack a foreign substance. So when I was growing up, every kid took a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to school. There were peanuts passed out as a snack. Peanuts were on airplanes. And nobody had peanut allergies. There were no kids carrying EpiPens to school. Now, of course, if a kid, opens a package of peanuts in a classroom, 5 kids are reaching for their EpiPen because so many people have peanut allergies. What happened? Well, our immune system long ago, nobody really had leaky gut because we hadn't killed off our microbiome. Believe it or not, we weren't eating whole grains up until a generation ago. We were throwing the bad parts away. And so our immune system was actually pretty chilled out. Now, almost all of us have a wiped out microbiome. Most of us have leaky gut. And so our immune system is on hyper alert. Our immune system now are marching around with Uzis. And so when a kind of an innocent little peanut lectin comes by, we're firing at it. And so it's no wonder that, so many people have these issues with inflammation, with autoimmune diseases that no one ever had before.
Wow. From your experience, some of our viewers struggle with anxiety, sometimes even depression. What sort of impact does that have on our body? And what would you recommend for an individual to maybe eat or not eat to really heal themselves?
That's a great question. And I've become friends through the years with Dr. Daniel Amen of the Amen Clinics, who is a psychiatrist, who now he believes, as I do, that most anxiety and depression is actually coming from the gut and from our microbiome. And that I've had him on my podcast, the Dr. Gundry podcast. And, he said, I think we should actually probably get rid of the term mental illness and focus instead on, gut illness, gut dysbiosis. Women know this very well. They have a gut feeling, and they're absolutely correct about this. We now know that so many of the compounds that calm us and make us feel good, like serotonin, for instance, or GABA, are actually produced by the microbiome in the gut. The other thing that we're now well aware of is that if we have leaky gut, bad bacterial particles, which are called lipopolysaccharides, and there won't be a test, but I abbreviate them LPSs, and people can remember them by little pieces of shit because that's what they are. They're actually bacterial particles from our gut. Can get through the wall of our gut, and actually your brain senses these particles, and your brain immune system, called microglial cells, goes on high alert and literally attacks your own neurons, in a self-defense gone wrong. And so we see so many people, a lot of high achievers, who suffer from depression and anxiety. And when we get them eating foods that foster good bacteria, and those foods, for instance, are prebiotic fiber. These are soluble fibers that the good guys, what I call gut buddies, like to eat. And these good guys make a host of these compounds that are now called postbiotics that actually go to the brain and say, hey, everything's fine, relax, everything's good. And it's just amazing how many people we can actually get off of their antidepressants, their anti-anxiety drugs, just by changing the food we eat. Wow. It's like Dr. Amen said, who would have guessed? Again, up until a little over 10 years ago, nobody knew that this incredible organ existed within us. And nobody knew the power that these single cell organisms have over us.
Right. What would you say are some of the best foods for that?
Great. So some of the best foods are, there's a sugar molecule that we can't digest called inulin. And inulin is present in a lot of foods. For instance, it's highly present in asparagus. It's in the chicory family of vegetables. So radicchio, what many people think of, that Italian red lettuce, that it's in most grocery stores now. Belgian endive, which is easy to find. Frisée is another one. When I'm in Europe, particularly in France and Italy, I don't think I've ever had a salad that didn't have these chicory forms of vegetables, frisée and radicchio, in them. These cultures with great health really know what to feed their gut buddies. A lot of the tuberous vegetables, like, for instance, jicama, is loaded with soluble fiber. Yams are loaded with soluble fiber. Onions, leeks, garlic are loaded with soluble fiber. So these are, these are everyday foods. So it's easier than people think. Worst comes to worst, buy some flax seeds, grind them up, throw them in your smoothie, mix them in some goat yogurt. Buy some psyllium husk, easy to do, grind them up, throw them in what you want to eat. The more soluble fiber you get into your diet, the more you feed the good guys, and the more happy compounds they produce for your brain.
And how long would it normally take for an individual to start seeing changes?
It actually doesn't take very long. Some very good evidence that I've presented in the Plant Paradox. You can actually take a very bad gut microbiome full of bad bacteria, changing over to a high soluble fiber diet in 3 days shifts that microbiome into a bunch of gut buddies. Now, interestingly enough, you have to keep that up, because the same research shows that with every day you stop doing that, within 3 days, all the bad guys will come back and the good guys will leave. You have to give these guys what they want to eat. And they have incredible power. Some fascinating studies done in China a couple of years ago looked at the effect of a water fast. And the proposition was that gut bacteria themselves control your hunger. And it's called the gut-centric theory of hunger. And if you gave bacteria what they wanted to eat, then you wouldn't get hunger signals. And so what they did is they put people on a 14-day water fast, and half the individuals were given 100 calories of prebiotic fiber. That means calories that the humans couldn't digest, but the gut bacteria could. And the individuals who got the prebiotic fiber had absolutely no hunger for 14-day water fast, whereas the individuals who didn't get the prebiotic fiber were hungry. And so you think about that and go, wait a minute, what these guys are eating is actually, controlling whether I'm hungry or not. And we know that these gang members, what I call the bad bacteria, actually control our appetite for certain foods. These gang members want simple sugars and want saturated fats. And if you want to describe the American diet, the Western diet now, it is loaded with sugars and saturated fats. And you can show in both animal and human studies that if we do a fecal transplant with bad bacteria into skinny rats, skinny humans, that they will become fat because they will change their food preferences. And that's really scary that these organisms can actually control most of our behavior.
It's crazy. What's your thoughts on taking supplements such as probiotics to improve gut health? Because there's so many out there. Do you recommend it? What would you say?
So most probiotics, friendly bacteria, never actually get to where they need to be in the gut. Most of them are destroyed by stomach acid. What's fascinating is there is a class of probiotics that was discovered about 10 years ago called Akkermansia muciniphila. And it's okay. It basically means mucus-loving bug. And we know now that there is a layer of mucus that lines our gut. And the thicker this mucus layer, the safer we are from, among other things, lectins. And there's very, very good evidence that the thicker your mucus layer, the longer you live and the better health. Akkermansia eats mucus. It lives in this mucus layer, right at the lining of our gut. Interestingly enough, the more mucus it eats, the more mucus our gut wall produces. And so it's actually a win-win. And studies have shown that the more Akkermansia you have, the longer you live and the longer you live well. Now, Akkermansia was the holy grail of probiotics because nobody could grow it. Nobody could produce it in a form that would make it past your stomach until just recently, literally about 4 months ago. A company called Pendulum Life, and I have no relationship with them, after 10 years, actually clinically produced Akkermansia. And I've had Colleen, the CEO, on my podcast, and I got to tell you, I am so impressed with this bacteria. I've started taking it myself. I've given it to some of my mischievous patients, and it's too early to write about it, but the evidence is very impressive about what this bug does. They've done clinical studies in humans showing that their formula actually changes diabetics to pre-diabetics or not diabetics. So it's a game changer. But back to your question, the most of the probiotics that people take aren't very good. I make several probiotics. Most of my probiotics at Gundry MD are spore-forming probiotics that actually make it past your gastric acid, and there's good evidence that those work. I think what's more important is the probiotics have to have prebiotics to eat. And you could take all the probiotics in the world. If you don't give them what they want to eat, they're not going to grow, and they're not going to produce these postbiotic compounds that we need. I use the example here in Palm Springs, which is a desert. Let's suppose I sell my patient some grass seed, and they come back in 6 weeks and they said, you sold me bad grass seed, it didn't grow. And I said, well, what did you do with it? And they said, well, I took it out in the sand and I spread it around. And I said, well, did you water it? No, you didn't tell me to. What did you fertilize it? No, you didn't tell me to. I said, well, what did you expect? And it's the same way with probiotics. You got to give them what they need to grow and eat, or they're not going to grow.
Mm. So earlier, right at the start of this interview, you mentioned about the fact that you eat within a very strict window. Is it 2 hours, you said, for yourself?
Yeah, personally, 2 hours. So it's now been called the OMAD diet, 1 meal a day. Yeah, as I joke, you really have to get used to it. Otherwise, you go mad trying to do it. I do that during the winter from January through June, and I do it during the week. That actually gives me a considerable period of time each day where I'm producing ketones. And ketones are not a miraculous fuel that people think they are, but ketones are very important signaling molecules that tell our mitochondria to protect themselves and to actually waste energy. It's a concept called mitochondrial uncoupling, and to actually make more of themselves. And if you look at super old people, they have the most uncoupled mitochondria compared to people who don't get super old. And one of the ways, which is easy to uncouple mitochondria, is to extend the period of time that you're not eating during the day. It's one of the easiest techniques there is.
And is there benefits to the gut as well, or?
Great question. Turns out digestion is very expensive and it takes a ton of energy. And the gut wall needs to repair itself. So the more you spend not eating, the more time you have for the gut wall itself to repair itself. And interestingly enough, Akkermansia eats mucus. And if you're not eating very much, then Akkermansia thrives because it's one of the only bugs that can actually eat mucus. And so other bugs don't have much to eat, and Akkermansia actually proliferates. And it may be one of the reasons why fasting or intermittent fasting has such a beneficial effect, is Akkermansia every day gets the upper hand.
Right. So are you normally recommended just drinking water, or you can have coffee and...
Coffee, tea. There's some exciting new research by one of my colleagues from USC, Dr. Walter Longo, who's head of the Longevity Center there, that certain nut bars, if you have them like for a breakfast early in the morning, will not stop ketone production, which is actually exciting news. But in general, having black coffee, having tea doesn't break your fast. So lots of options.
Okay. And why is ketone production important?
So ketones, we've thought for years that ketones make the super fuel that your brain loves, that your mitochondria loves. Nothing could be further from the truth. Ketones are actually a lousy fuel, but ketones are an amazing signaling molecule that tell simplistically your mitochondria to protect themselves. And one of the now predominant theories of aging is aging occurs from mitochondrial damage. Making energy, making ATP, is incredibly damaging to mitochondria. And the more we can actually protect mitochondria from damage, the longer we're going to live. Let me let me summarize that. There's a theory of aging that's been prevalent for years, that the higher your metabolic rate, the faster you burn energy, the shorter your life. A fruit fly lives for a couple of weeks. A mouse lives for a couple of years. An elephant, can live for 70 years. A whale can live for 200 years. In general, the bigger, the slower the rate of aging. The problem with that theory is birds. Birds, very small, can live incredibly long lives. A hummingbird in captivity at an incredibly high metabolic rate can live 10 years. A parrot can live 80 to 100 years. And so what's going on? It turns out that birds have some of the highest mitochondrial uncoupling measured. And it's this, what's called mitochondrial uncoupling, that protects mitochondria from damage. And in Unlocking the Keto Code, I show people how to uncouple their mitochondria. And ketones happen to be a very efficient way of uncoupling mitochondria. And that's why being in ketosis for part of the day is so beneficial. Now, contrary to what other people have been led to believe, being in ketosis 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year is really bad for you. And I won't bore you with why, but you want to be able to break ketosis on a 24-hour basis.
Yeah, that's great. Final question. If you were to pretty much summarize what you've shared with us today in the most easiest way possible and leave us with just one message that you want all of us to remember, what would that message be?
For the best trick for prolonging your health is shortening the period of time that you eat food during the day. Second best trick, try not to eat within 3 hours of going to bed, because you actually have to do a wash cycle of your brain. Your brain literally goes through a wash cycle that gets rid of debris. And that wash cycle happens early in sleep. It's called deep sleep. And if you eat near the time you go to bed, all of the blood flow that would normally wash your brain is down in your gut digesting food. And just try not to eat near bedtime.